welcome to our panel on Literotica, the 6 do's and 9 don'ts on writing romantic erotica into your novel. We here are full coverage writers, an online resource and repository of resources and repositories to help you write and get your stories out of your brain onto paper and then onto the bookshelves. I am Will, the resident erotica writer, and this is Charles, our instigator of creative insanity.
Good evening.
He found his stage voice. The following 15 tips are ways to help get some sex scenes and erotica into your novelization without it basically turning into what we would call smut or porn. We're looking here more to add a little bit more adult content to a serious novel as opposed to just getting into full-on pornography. The first point we have is to maintain consistency with your point of view, which is generally a good rule of thumb when writing anything, but I find it could be difficult in the heat of the moment when writing a sex scene to lose your point of view or be tempted to switch point of view during a sex scene. But doing so can be confusing to your readers when you're suddenly going from, say, your top's head to your bottom's head without any indication onto the switch. If your point of view is more of a narrative, omnipresent narrator who's able to get into anyone's head, it can be a little bit easier. But I do recommend if you're going to change point of view and thought processes from one person in your scene to another, I follow the same rules with conversation as I do with this and just start a new paragraph. A typical good rule is when a new person starts speaking, you go to a new paragraph. So if you're going through someone's head and describing what they're thinking or experiencing, it's a good idea to also cut to a new paragraph. Another way to change point of view without breaking too much consistency is with what I call a chapter break. This isn't a new chapter, but a break within a chapter. Sometimes if you're reading a novel, you'll see multiple spaces or even a divider bar between paragraphs, usually done when a chapter changes locations or scenery or does a time shift. I find if you have a person who's maybe peeking in on two people enjoying each other, or another good example is if you have someone performing on a webcam, an adult webcam, and you want to jump from the performer to someone watching, since you're changing kind of changing scenery, it's good to just do that kind of chapter break jump to show that you're doing a change in scenery or a change in location, as well as a change in perspective.
What happens when there's 3 people already in the entire scene?
Well, then you would just use a new paragraph break. You would just probably have to use a lot more of them as you have more people involved. 3, 4, 12, you know.
And a half.
What kind of adult scenes are you writing?
My space opera.
I don't want to know.
Don't you remember?
No, I don't want to know.
Okay, yes, you did no tentacles, honey. No tentacles.
Yeah. That's more of a quarter anyway. So one thing I find is helpful for keeping your point of view is to keep in mind where you want your readers to be focused, which character you want to be focused. If you have a character that's experiencing something new for the first time, you want your readers to go along with that new experience, so you'll want most, if not all, of your point of view to be focused on that character, their experiences, their thoughts, their reactions, with a little bit from whatever or whoever they're partnered with at the time. Another thing to remember is your characters' personalities, their anatomy, and basic physics. This is definitely something you want to keep in mind when you're looking to keep a certain level of realism within your story. There are certain limits to take into account, both physically and emotionally. Some people aren't always comfortable doing certain things. So if, like in anything else, favorite foods they don't like, types of movie genres, things like that, there are certain sexual activities that your characters may be interested in taking part in, and others they may not be interested in taking part in. This is a good way to add some adult depth to your character's personality and help to create a 3-dimensional character. So, maybe you've got someone who's a little shy and a little quiet. They're going to probably be rather shy and quiet in your adult scene as well, you know. And if you've got a more boisterous character, they may just want to have fun with sex. You know, sometimes you just want to have a little fun.
Probably like a Jack Harkness character from Doctor Who is just into anything and everyone.
Yeah, sure. I've never seen Doctor Who, so I'm going to have to take your word for that one. Another thing to keep in point for when you're striving for realism is anatomy. Human body can only bend so far, twist so far, and take so much in one scene. So, what was I going to say? I lost my spot.
It's that line right there.
Oh, thank you. That's so helpful. So, when you're writing your sex scene, it's good to remember your character's physique. Remember what they can handle. If you have a very physically fit character, there's a lot more they can do than the average Joe type who doesn't work out regularly, or maybe, like myself, a little on the flabby side. So you just want to keep that in mind, add more realistic depth. It makes the scenes more, what's the word I'm looking for?
Realistic and believable.
Relatable.
Yeah.
More relatable to a average reader, average person.
I would think flexibility would fit in there as well.
Yes, flexibility.
Unless everyone in your universe does yoga.
Yeah. Well, you know, if everybody in your universe has rubber bones, then do whatever they want. But, yeah, if you've got someone that's very flexible, they may be able to get their feet behind their head. But not everyone can do that. Another thing I like to point out is remember basic physics. If you've ever seen the Kama Sutra, I've looked through it. There are some positions that, unless you're really physically fit or perhaps in a zero-gravity environment, might be a little tricky to pull off. It doesn't mean you can't attempt them, but what I like to think is that the more challenging a scene is, the more rewarding it could be if you can pull it off, but the greater a chance of somebody maybe taking an elbow to the eye or slipping and falling or something like that. Another important feature for writing your sex scenes is to maintain good balance between foreplay, intimacy, climax, and afterglow. Something that some people sometimes leave out. The foreplay is maybe not the most exciting part, but it's a good way to get your readers as well as your characters into the right feel and the right mood for your scene. If you're going for a rushed scene, rushed sex scene, you can do a really quick short foreplay to show that either your characters just really want to get at it or they don't have a lot of time. If you're looking for a slower, more romantic sex scene, you can drag the foreplay out for almost a good chapter. Really, a good date, a nice movie, some nice talk, strawberries, wine, champagne, whatever works for your characters, whatever works for you.
I like strawberries.
That's good to know. I'll keep that in mind.
They don't like me, though.
Oh. Once the mood is set, you're ready to get down to intimacy for your characters. This is where your own experience can really show. So try to stick to poses, positions, and activities you know or are comfortable with, at least for a start. This way you can really better describe what your characters are doing from experience. Another thing is, and this brought to mind from someone, a comment I read on another story, feel free to take time to describing the first penetration if you have a male involved. Sometimes writers get through that in a sentence, but there's a lot that happens on that first penetration, so going into a little bit more detail on that first, I don't want to keep using the same word over again, but penetration is a really good way to just get into the scene in general. Once you've gone through the intimacy, which itself can be a little short because there's a lot of repetitive actions involved in actual sex, unless your characters are changing positions every few minutes. You have to figure out when's a good time to time out your character's climax, which can be tricky for timing out the climax for a scene, a story, a novel, anything. This is just a little bit more exciting.
Tricky in real life, too.
It is tricky in real life. This is a good point to get into your characters' heads, describe what they're thinking and feeling at this highest point in intercourse. And it's also a good time to have someone miss the mark. If you don't want your sex scene to come out exactly perfect, maybe someone gets off a little before the other person. It does happen in real life, and, porn would probably have us believe it's perfect every time, but it's not. So this is a good way to sneak in some more conversation, get a chance to have one person console another, or continue on in a different route to help the second person get off. Or maybe they get it right the first time. You never know. After that, it's a good chance to get into the afterglow, which is something that's sometimes skipped. This is a good chance, again, to really get into an intimate matter and really make your sex scene matter to your story as a whole. At this point, characters and people tend to be more open, more vulnerable, so they may be more likely to say something they wouldn't say in another situation to their partner, and you can really start to show how the two people or more involved really feel for each other, or really show how they feel about each other. Like if one person decides to not stick around for snuggles and cuddles afterwards, you can show that there's less of a deeper emotional bond between the two people aside from just sex.
What if they just need to go out for a smoke?
Well, you can do that too. But then if the smoke's more important than snuggles, what does that say about their relationship and their priorities?
Well, everyone needs nicotine, obviously.
After that, the fourth point I have is to know when to fade to black. Ending a scene is always kind of tricky, knowing exactly when's a good time to end it. And for a sex scene, it's not really all that different. I think it's important to keep in mind what you're trying to show or accomplish with your scene, what part of your overall story you're trying to get across in this scene. If you haven't gotten that across yet, it's not necessarily time to end the scene yet. You may want to think about now is the time to get that across, or maybe you need to go back and rework earlier stuff if you want to end your scene at a particular point. The obvious choice is right after your characters are done, sometimes during the afterglow. Maybe they say their I love yous, curl up, go to sleep, end scene, move on to the next day, next week, next location, whatever. But as long as you make sure you've got your message across, that's fine. If not, maybe you want to continue on. Maybe there's an interruption. Maybe they're interrupted before they're finished. That does happen sometimes, especially if your characters may have children or something, or nosy neighbors.
But who would ever interrupt someone else for anything?
I have no response to that other than... So the interruption may be a good way to extend the scene and get to your point across, interrupting the sex, at which point you won't want to end your scene after the sex part is over because there's more to say. Maybe your characters try to go at it again. Maybe they're too flustered or thrown off by whatever the interruption was. And sometimes maybe one round isn't enough. Maybe your characters get through having sex and decide they want to go again, but you've got your point across. Showing them go back towards foreplay might be a good time to fade out then. Or, if you want to keep your story a little bit under the age limit, or under a more general audience age limit, fading out is probably a good idea to do during the foreplay, since you can't really talk about outright sex and keep it PG-13. Another important thing to do is to research other people's styles to help develop your own, which is another good thing to do when writing in general. It can just be a little bit trickier when writing erotica in comfortably finding other erotica that you want to write. But it's a good way to learn about other sexual acts you haven't participated in. Maybe there are kinks you yourself don't want to do, but you want to write about. Doing a little bit of research will help you get that across in a more realistic sense. A good place to find erotica is on the internet. A lot of people post it there, and if you know where to look, it's not that hard to find. There are a lot of websites specifically for it, or there are a lot of authors on Tumblr that'll post there or link to other websites, Twitter, Facebook. You can, if you're crafty, even find it in a bookstore, even though it may be awkward to ask in a bookstore for that particular genre sometimes. I just recommend you make sure you do your research on the authors, because some wildly popular books aren't necessarily accurate for the kinks that they're trying to portray. And you don't want to use those as a reference. Yes, we're not going to mention any authors or any titles here.
Until we're off air.
You're off, yeah.
Then all bets are off.
Just make sure you do your research and check around to make sure another novelist has been accurate about describing their kink before you try to use it as an example. The last do I have is to keep in mind who your audience is. It's always important to do when writing anything, but when writing a sex scene, it can be particularly tricky. Obviously, you have a certain age limit of 18 plus. You're not going to be writing for underage teenagers if you're writing this sort of thing, because likely they're not going to be able to get their hands on the books. You can't guarantee that. So what you need to do is keep in mind the interests of the people you're writing for. If you're intending to write for people that are more mellow, looking for romance, then you'll want to avoid writing about some of the more intense kinks and perversions, and you'll want to stick to writing more romantic style erotica with a lot of love in it. But if you are looking to write about certain kinks, then you want to really do your focus and study on those particular kinks or fetishes, whatever they are, and really keep in mind that you want to basically pander to these people. Mm-hmm. You don't want to make it seem degrading unless the kink is degradation, which it's there for, but you just want to make sure you do it in a way that is approachable and relatable. And if you're having any trouble getting that down, it never hurts to have other people critique your work, especially friends. If you have even family that you're comfortable having read your adult literature, you can even use them. Not everyone does, but some people do. But friends are usually safe. If you have friends that are open-minded, you can have them review that kind of stuff as well for you. All right, and that covers the 6 do's, which brings us to the 9 don'ts. The first one I have is don't make sex perfect. There are certain misconceptions in the adult film world particularly that will make sex seem like it's something that is perfect and wonderful and goes off without a hitch every time. That is not real. Realistically, that doesn't happen. Realistically, sex is messy and noisy and awkward, and things go wrong. Sometimes. Not all the time, but sometimes. But that's a good thing. That's real. You want to be awkward sometimes. You want to have something go wrong, especially if your characters are exploring something new that they haven't experienced yet. Maybe they tie a knot incorrectly, or someone's not as bendy as they hoped.
Where did the keys to those handcuffs go again?
Oh, I'll never tell.
Well, that's going to get awkward later.
Check the bedside table.
I can't reach that from here.
Another thing is if you're including virgins, false starts, slip-ups, premature finishing, those are all things that can happen, and while unfortunate, are realistic. So if you're looking for realistic sex to add to your novel, feel free to add it in. Like I said, also, it's messy, it's silly, it's hilarious, it can be painful, awkward. If you have characters using lubrication, maybe they spill some, maybe don't use enough, use too much.
Use the wrong one.
Use the wrong one. We'll get to that next. Sometimes natural gases can be raised up. Characters can burp or fart. Females might queef a little bit. This is all stuff that really happens that you don't necessarily see in adult films. So as I was saying, sometimes things go wrong. Camera batteries die. You run out of film. Cameraman fumbles around. But it's a good chance to add some more depth to your scene and make it more realistic and more relatable. You know, cramps, overheating, physical overexertion, distractions, having to go to the bathroom. This is all stuff that happens, and it's all good stuff to include if you want to have more realistic sex as part of your novel as opposed to just writing porn. Not that there's anything wrong with just porn, but that's a different panel.
I'll be in my boat.
All right, so as I indicated before, part 2, beware of improper lubrications. A while back, I found a list online of over 200 items that people writing their fan fictions used as lubrication. About 198 of them were horrible decisions, and I am not going to repeat most of them here because we'll all be cringing and having a bad time. But there were a few on the list that seemed like they might be good ideas, but they're not necessarily good ideas unless you're really desperate. Some things they used were saliva, water, cooking oil, certain beverages, certain foods, anything that seemed somewhat liquidy and slippery. But there are problems with those, and I do recommend avoiding them unless you're going to include the fact that they might not be as comfortable as they seem to be. The only guaranteed thing that'll work is a professional, actual sexual lubricant like KY jelly or something from Trojan or whichever brand you prefer. There's plenty out there to choose from. A lot of the other ones seem viable but will probably fail. Saliva is a big one, but the problem with saliva is that it dries really quickly. If anyone has ever checked the wind with their finger, it's dry again in a matter of seconds. So it's not really a good thing to use for lubrication sexually. Another thing, again, is water, but I think it has the same problem of drying pretty quickly and just not being all that slippery, really, unless you have a lot of water. What else did I have here?
Mostly the disturbing ones.
Yeah, I don't really want to get into the disturbing ones too much. Certain other ones, like vegetable oils and things like that, seem good, but I try to follow the rule of if it would sting on a cut, it'll sting in your butt. So it's just something to keep in mind before you go to improvise lubrication for your characters. So unless one of your characters is rather masochistic, try to avoid things that would sting if you got it on an open cut, because it'll sting down in any orifice that you may be involved with.
So none of that icy hot style lubricant that was going around?
Don't. That was actually pretty seriously bad. Trojan released an icy hot lubricant that was really bad because it had actual capsaicin in it. That did not go over well. Yeah, no. Not unless you are an extreme masochist do I recommend anything with capsaicin in it.
Unless you're writing torture.
Yeah.
Different panel.
Different panel. My third point is, excuse me, don't make it up. If you're writing about a kink or a fetish or something that you don't know about, and someone who does know about it reads it, you're going to turn them off. They're going to read it and go, this person has no idea what they're talking about, and then they're just going to put your book down and walk away. And then you'll never get their money. You lose readership. They'll go online and say, these people don't know what they're talking about, and there go your book sales. So obviously, with this kind of stuff, getting first-hand experience may not always be an option. Depends on how open-minded you are. So I recommend doing a lot of research, especially asking people who are involved in whatever you're writing about. You want to get as much first or second-hand knowledge as you can to be as realistic as possible. Otherwise, you have scandalous novels that come out, which, again, we will not name titles. So, if you're comfortable exploring and experimenting, give it a try. If not, there are research manuals. You can go online, see what other people are doing, see how it really works. Try to get in their heads, try to get a mentality behind it, and just try to be as realistic as possible and make up as little as possible. But while you're looking for references, don't use porn as a reference. Looking for references is really good, but you want those references to be realistic and believable. And pornography is pretty much the opposite of that. These are basically fictional movies. They're done in multiple takes with different scenes from different angles. It's not one fluid shot. It's just like any other movie. So a lot of things are faked and embellished just for the sake of the movie and making money. As a result, it's not usually realistic on how long people can go, what people look like, how, perfectly fit everyone is and things like that, and basically any of that kind of stuff.
You mean Brazzers isn't real?
Horribly not, no.
They lied to me.
Yes, well, porn lies to everyone. The only porn I would recommend, if you're going to use porn as a reference, is homemade porn. Anything that's done on a personal little camera or on a cell phone or anything like that, because that's typically not done in multiple takes. It's one shot of probably grainy, poor quality porn, but it's as realistic as you're going to get when it comes to actual porn. Otherwise, it's just, you might as well be using, I don't know, Porky's as your reference material.
You mean that wasn't real either?
Sorry, no.
Oh.
All right. Fifth tip is to don't use certain kinks just for their shock value. This is my trigger warning section. A little shock in your story every now and then as part of your plot isn't such a bad thing, but when you're using certain taboo sex activities, it can be really triggering or a really bad turnoff to some people, and you really just want to avoid triggering people's anything, really. And certain things like incest, bestiality, anything that would usually be considered illegal, don't use it just for shock value. Don't just suddenly surprise your readers with it like, oh, by the way, these two brother and sister are doing it behind their parents' back. That could be really triggering to some people, turn a lot of people off. They'll just shut your book, go away, never read anything you write ever again, kiss their money goodbye, because you're not going to get it and you won't be able to sell a sequel to them.
What about an Oedipus style, where there was theoretically reasoning behind the plot?
Well, that's what I'm getting to. If you build up for it, if it's part of your plot and you build up that this is going to happen, or it's happening but they, like in Oedipus, they don't know they're related or anything like that, you can kind of soften the blow or at least make it more believable. I recommend a lot of warnings, like if it, again, is sibling related. One sibling is obviously very close and protective to the other one, so that when you do drop that, oh, she has feelings she's not supposed to have, your readers go, oh, that explains that. It's not as shocking. But yeah, basically you want to avoid anything that might trigger any kind of trauma in people. So unless it's absolutely necessary and you can really work it in well, try to avoid certain shock value sexual kinks. My sixth point is to don't write a sex scene just to have a sex scene. I personally believe that every scene in your novel should move your master plot along. It should always add to your overall plot and your overall story. And I believe your sex scenes can do that as well. You can use your sex scenes as a point where your characters are more vulnerable and thus more likely to say or show a side of themselves that they wouldn't show in everyday life. You can show how they feel about another person, or reveal some kind of character trait about them, or in some way to help move your plot along in your sex scene. Otherwise, if you're just writing the sex scene for a sex scene, you might as well just be writing porn, which, again, you can do, but it doesn't really add to an overall novel. It's mostly just there for, oh, hey, look, by the way, my novel has actual sex scenes in it where you can enjoy reading these two characters getting off.
That's what fan fiction's for.
That's what fan fiction is for. A good example is, I always forget it, 1985, was it? The dystopian one.
84.
84? Anyone? 1984? There were a couple sex scenes in that one that actually showed progression of the story. The first one when he had with his wife and they had to do it between the sheet and it was all
It's
very...
been forever since I've read it.
Yeah, it's been a while for me. I just remember it showing that it was very cold. And then when he cheated on her and it was like, oh, well, this can be fun. What have I been doing? Maybe I should overthrow society. But you definitely want to have it add something to your overall story and not just be in there as kind of a gimmick and like, oh yeah, by the way, these two are having sex. If you're just going to show that they're having sex, you can probably cut off around the foreplay part and just imply that they're going to have sex without going into the details of it and ultimately detracting from your overall novel. But while you are writing your sex scenes, again, remember, don't forget the limitations of anatomy. As I said before, people are only so flexible, they're only so strong, but I want to get more into that because it's usually what I see most forgotten and ignored. So, example, unless your character is double jointed, they're not necessarily going to be wrapping themselves up in a pretzel while having sex, as exciting as that can be. A lot of people have trouble getting their feet up to their heads, never mind their legs behind their shoulders, myself included. So unless you've established that one of your characters is very athletic, acrobatic, or flexible, try to show that they're not all that bendy, you know, which is pretty easy to do if they attempt to do it and get a cramp or just can't do it. Another good thing to keep in mind is strength and stamina. Not everyone can hold another person up in the air while making love. Some people can. I can't. And that's just, most people can't. So that's a good way to make it more relatable. If they attempt to do it, you should specify that the person who's holding the other person up is having some trouble, might be a little bit strained, might need to brace against a wall, something like that.
Walls are your friend.
Walls are your friend. And speaking of stamina, people can only go for so long. Those all night long sessions probably aren't going on all night long. I forget where it was. Someone said the average time for sex was about an hour, including everything from foreplay to afterglow.
Yeah, because the actual act itself was like...
The actual act
5 to 10
itself
minutes.
is just a few minutes long. 5 to 10 minutes long is average for a person for the actual sex. But if you include the foreplay, the afterglow, the whole 9 yards, it can go on for about an hour.
What about the interruptions?
The interruptions can make it longer or shorter depending on how good or bad the interruptions are.
And how well you are recovering from them.
Indeed. Also, fluids are not infinite as some adult movies may make you think to believe. Every time a guy gets off, he's going to have less and less each time until eventually there's nothing left. And that won't take long. And, excuse me, women also eventually run out of their own lubrication after going for too long, which can then lead to uncomfortable chafing and unpleasant continued sex. So again, and even just getting hungry, getting tired, going all night is not something that people can do unless they take breaks, which is fine. Nothing wrong with taking breaks, having a snack, having a drink,
Taking a cat nap.
taking a cat nap, and then getting right back at it. And this is something I point out as I see it exaggerated in porn a lot, is how much a guy produces. Average amount is between a teaspoon and a tablespoon per shot. If you're watching porn and you see more than that, like a lot more than that, it's usually faked with pumps and hoses and concealed things like that. Average is not all that much. It can be more a little more than that, depending on how long it's been since the guy's gotten off and how much buildup he's had. But in general, if it's like liters that you're seeing, it's probably not real.
What about anime?
Strange mutants.
Hentai is not real. Hentai is the worst offender. Excuse me. My 8th point is to don't ignore the consequences of sex. That can seem kind of vague, but it is an important thing to keep in mind. When two people or more people are having sex, there's usually deeper ramifications than just one night of fun. One obvious course to go is with pregnancy. A woman has sex with a man, and it's not protected, it's a good chance she could get pregnant. And unless you specify that she's on birth control and you don't include a condom, you should mention at least the risk of pregnancy. Unless you have it set up either someone's infertile, or if she says it's a safe time to do it and not get pregnant, which is not 100% accurate. Nothing is except a condom, really. Even that, yeah. Nothing is 100% certain to do it. There's always the risk of pregnancy.
Even abstinence for Christians.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it didn't work once. It's worked 99.99% of the time, which is not 100.
But this may also be one of those instances where you can insert like the interruption,
Mhm.
where it's like, oh hey, wait a minute.
Yep.
You
Wait a minute, I need
have,
to-
or
I need
are
to
you
put on a rubber, or are you on a pill, something like that. Another thing to keep in mind is sexually transmitted diseases. If your character is having a lot of unprotected sex with people he or she does not know, there is a good chance he or she is going to pick up something he or she does not really want. You don't necessarily have to go that route, but if you have it set up that one of your characters is a little loose, that other characters may be like, this is really risky. Why are you doing this? Why are you always going out and having sex with strangers you don't know? You don't want to get A, B, C, whatever diseases you want to throw in there. There are also less life-changing but still important consequences to sex, usually on a more emotional level. Excuse me. All depending on your character's feelings about how important sex is to a relationship. If one character feels that sex means we're monogamous, we're going to get married, it's just you and me, that's something some people feel, and it's an important thing to attribute. Some people also don't want to have sex until they're married, which means it is very much a monogamous thing. Having sex beforehand could be very devastating to that person, even if there is no consequence of getting a disease or getting pregnant. On an emotional and sometimes religious level, it has an important consequence to having sex. If I can, my pages are sticking together.
What were you doing?
Fine comment.
Very important research. All right, my last point is to avoid sex cliches.
Continue.
What kind of sex cliches are you doing back there?
Nothing.
All right, one example I have of a sex cliche, which at the last panel made a lot of people confused, is the idea that maybe your story has an evil demon-worshipping cult ready to worship their dark lord into the world. All they need is a virgin sacrifice. Your hero has invaded their cult and is ready to stop them and has rescued the virgin sacrifice, but they're trapped and can't escape. So you decide to have your hero remove the virgin from virgin sacrifice by having them have sex. By the time they're done, she's not a virgin anymore, and thus the plot is foiled. Don't do that. This is a cliche, and nowadays most people see cliches and roll their eyes and groan and go, oh, that old story again. Here we go. That's a good example. A lot of movies use these other ones as examples. Falling in love with someone in one day. You meet someone in the morning, and by the end of the day, you're ready to get married. That doesn't happen in real life. Or the hero having sex with the female protagonist right before saving the day. Works in James Bond, but if you're writing an action story, it's pretty cliche. A lot of people would see it coming, so not including it would definitely surprise your readers even more. Save it for after the day is saved as a little reward. Excuse me. But basically, and I believe this is a good rule in general, just avoid all cliches as you can. They're played out, they're pretty cheap and they're not as creative anymore. You want to try and be more creative with your stories, more creative with your sex scenes, and more realistic with your sex scenes. So unless you're writing a parody, I mostly just recommend to avoid the cliches as all as possible. And that is my 6 do's and 9 don'ts for adding erotic scenes to your romantic novels. If you have any questions, you can, I assume we have time still now. Does anyone have any questions?
You didn't explain what a real virgin sacrifice was.
Oh, the real virgin sacrifice, that's right. Traditionally, a real virgin sacrifice is with virgin blood, which is blood that has not been used in a sacrifice before. It does not have to come from a virgin or even be human. It just has to have never been used as part of a ritual before. That's more of a realistic and creative take if you're going to go with virginal blood as part of a ritual for whatever you want to have done.
Stay away from sacrifice. It's just messy.
Yeah.
And noisy.
Chickens are tastier.
The feathers make nice pillows.
I have a question.
Yeah?
How do you feel about when a scene, like, so after a climax, the scene will sometimes literally just cut to black, and then the next scene, they're basically just having breakfast as if it never happened. What would you say that says about the people who just engaged?
Well, I would say that the writer missed out on an opportunity, definitely. But it depends on which way you take it. Again, if you've accomplished what your sex scene is going to apply to your story before the afterglow, like in the foreplay or during the actual intercourse, then you can cut the foreplay short and fade out, implying that they're snuggling up, or perhaps you can make breakfast part of the afterglow, where they're sitting at the breakfast table and just enjoying each other's company after enjoying each other's company.
Maybe perhaps even add color commentary during breakfast. Like
You could
you
have a
left-
third person going, these walls aren't as soundproof as you think they are there.
Or, hey, you happen to tip over that bottle of lube. You should clean it up now.
It's true. Anything like that. It depends on what route you take it. If you don't accomplish what you wanted to accomplish and you just kind of cut to breakfast, it could also kind of show that the sex is pretty monotonous for the couple if they just have sex and then go on with their regular life together without it adding any kind of romance to their life. Then there wasn't too much emotional depth behind the sex. It's just, oh, it's Friday night. It's the night we always have sex. Or Saturday morning or Sunday morning, or whenever they regularly have sex.
Or just 2 o'clock.
Yeah, afternoon delight.
As long as it's not a nooner.
All right, so are there any other questions? Can't think of any now. We'll be around in the vendor area tomorrow. We are full coverage writers for those who may have missed it. Again, we are recording this panel. It'll be on our website after cameraman over there has finished editing it, although there is a version from Kineticon already up there. Just go onto YouTube and search for Full Coverage Writers, or visit our website at fullcoveragewriters.com.
FCWriters.com.
FCWriters.com with an S.
Same thing.
With an S.
FCWriters with an S.com. And again, I am Will, and
I'm
this is
Charles.
Charles. Thanks for joining us tonight. Hello, and welcome to our panel on Literotica, the 6 do's and 9 don'ts on writing romantic erotica into your novel. We here are Full Coverage Writers, an online resource and repository of resources and repositories to help you write and get your stories out of your brain onto paper and then onto the bookshelves. I am Will, the resident erotica writer, and this is Charles, our instigator of creative insanity.
Good evening.
He found his stage voice. The following 15 tips are ways to help get some sex scenes and erotica into your novelization without it basically turning into what we would call smut or porn. We're looking here more to add a little bit more adult content to a serious novel, as opposed to just getting into full-on pornography. The first point we have is to maintain consistency with your point of view, which is generally a good rule of thumb when writing anything, but I find it could be difficult in the heat of the moment when writing a sex scene to lose your point of view or be tempted to switch point of view during a sex scene. But doing so can be confusing to your readers when you're suddenly going from, say, your top's head to your bottom's head without any indication onto the switch. If your point of view is more of a narrative, omnipresent narrator who's able to get into anyone's head, it can be a little bit easier. But I do recommend, if you're going to change point of view and thought processes from one person in your scene to another, I follow the same rules with conversation as I do with this, and just start a new paragraph. A typical good rule is when a new person starts speaking, you go to a new paragraph. So if you're going through someone's head and describing what they're thinking or experiencing, it's a good idea to also cut to a new paragraph. Blech. There are certain limits to take into account, both physically and emotionally. Some people aren't always comfortable doing certain things. So if, like in anything else, favorite foods they don't like, types of movie genres, things like that, there are certain sexual activities that your characters may be interested in taking part in, and others they may not be interested in taking part in. This is a good way to add some adult depth to your character's personality and help to create a three-dimensional character. So, maybe you've got someone who's a little shy and a little quiet. They're going to probably be rather shy and quiet in your adult scene as well, And if you've got a more boisterous character, they may just want to have fun with sex. Sometimes you just want to have a little fun.
Probably like a Jack Harkness character from Doctor Who who's just into anything and every one.
Yeah, sure. I've never seen Doctor Who, so I'm going to have to take your word for that one. Another thing to keep in,
And a half.
What kind of adult scenes are you writing?
My space opera.
I don't want to know.
Don't you remember?
No, I don't want to know.
Okay, good. So you did no tentacles, honey. No tentacles.
That's more of a quarter anyway. So one thing I find is helpful for keeping your point of view is to keep in mind where you want your readers to be focused, which character you want to be focused. If you have a character that's experiencing something new for the first time, you want your readers to go along with that new experience, so you'll want most, if not all, of your point of view to be focused on that character, their experiences, their thoughts, their reactions, with a little bit from whatever or whoever they're partnered with at the time. Another thing to remember is your characters' personalities, their anatomy, and basic physics. This is definitely something you want to keep in mind when you're looking to keep a certain level of realism within your story. Another way to change point of view without breaking too much consistency is with what I call a chapter break. This isn't a new chapter, but a break within a chapter. Sometimes if you're reading a novel, you'll see multiple spaces or even a divider bar between paragraphs, usually done when a chapter changes locations or scenery or does a time shift. I find if you have a person who's maybe peeking in on two people enjoying each other, or another good example is if you have someone performing on a webcam, an adult webcam, and you want to jump from the performer to someone watching, since you're changing kind of changing scenery, it's good to just do that kind of chapter break jump to show that you're doing a change in scenery or a change in location, as well as a change in perspective.
What happens when there's 3 people already in the entire scene?
Well, then you would just use a new paragraph break. You would just probably have to use a lot more of them as you have more people involved. 3, 4,
12.
12.